Hi, welcome back to the Bible, My Cats and I. I'm so excited about today. This is an amazing chapter in the book of Matthew. Chapter 17 we're at already. This is called The Astonishing Message of the Transfiguration. Hey, by the way, we're having an amazing storm as well happening right now. We've got wind and rain and thunder and lightning and such going on, so you may hear a little bit of that in the background. I apologize. I got Panger curled up here, all trying to stay warm and dry inside the house, and so he's my audience today. If you haven't read through chapter 17 yet, please just press pause, read through Matthew chapter 17, and that will get you prepared for what it is we're going to talk about today. But I want to start with this thought. You know, throughout history, there have been many defining moments within the film industry where new technologies were utilized that changed the industry forever. Think about, for instance, Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. In 1937, that was the first feature-length animated film. Or think of, in 1977, Star Wars came on the scene, and Steven Spielberg was able to use new technologies to create effects that blew people's minds. Believe me, I was there. There was the jazz singer that brought talkies about, so sound that actually went with the film, so you could hear people's voices. That was amazing. But I think probably the most amazing cinematic moments of history was that moment when Dorothy opened the door of her sepia-toned house and stepped out into this magical, colorful world of Oz. That was when color came to Hollywood. It had been used in the industry before that, but that's when it came to the masses. And I've heard firsthand accounts from my own parents how in 1939 as children they went and saw that movie and were blown away. They were astonished by the brilliant colors of Oz. And Hollywood then has never been the same. So this is kind of like that, these events that we read about in chapter 17, specifically the Transfiguration and the effect that it had on its audience. The account is just astonishing. And if you think about it, up until now, what we've heard about throughout all the previous 16 chapters, there were a couple of chapters about the birth narrative, and in that some hints about what was going to be told, what was to come. And then we saw teaching, Sermon on the Mount and such, and then right after that we've seen healings, seen more teachings, and we've seen this controversy between Jesus and the religious leaders of the time. But this changes everything. What we read about in the first 8 verses of this chapter is something else altogether. The meaning behind this event and the Transfiguration colors everything that came before, and it colors everything that will follow. So I'm going to start, hopefully you've already read it, but I'm going to start here by reading these first 8 verses. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. If this truly happened as it was described, what must that have been like? What would your response have been if you were Peter, John, or James? Peter often gets kind of made fun of. He gets a bad rap for his initial response. He wants to build monuments, basically, to this event. But that was actually really understandable, considering his place and time. It was like, let's set aside this special moment as a moment to remember and a moment to learn from. So he wanted to set up, build these tabernacles, tents, monuments, whatever you want to call them. Matthew chooses to include this story for his own purposes of his own gospel writings. And there are both historical significance and spiritual significance. Now, we can read these astonishing events just as they are. But I want to go a little deeper and read the spiritual significance, the spiritual meaning that it holds for the original audience and for us. So let's take a look. What do you think of when you think of a holy moment when someone went up a mountain? Well, for Matthew's audience, that would have been Moses. They would have thought of Moses going up Mount Sinai to receive the law of God from them. That's a story that we find back in the book of Exodus, chapter 24, and we'll get to that in a minute. And Matthew is using that and the audience's recollection of that for his own purposes in this chapter 17 and his story about the Transfiguration. So here, this story in Matthew starts out with these words. After 6 days, and I'm going to stop right there. After 6 days, that sounds sort of insignificant. Well, after 6 days. But actually, 6 days is a significant time frame that has some meaning in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's thought to be the number of days that were necessary to lead up to a holy event. It sort of stems from the original creation stories, right? God taking 6 days to create and then resting on the seventh day. But we also see in Exodus chapter 24 that I had just talked about, where Moses waited for 6 days on Mount Sinai for God. Oh, there's thunder. That was appropriate, wasn't it? And so here in Matthew, the mention of 6 days is setting the scene, basically, for drawing parallels between Moses and Jesus. Then we see, all right, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, his brother. We'll stop right there. If we go back to that Exodus 24, in fact, you know what? Let's do that. Flip in your Bibles back to Exodus. It's right after the book of Genesis, Exodus chapter 24. Let me grab it. Exodus chapter 24. Look at verse 9. It says, Moses and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and then the 70 elders, but his best closest buddies, his brother Aaron and 2 others, Nadab and Abihu, and he takes them and he went up. And here we see Jesus takes Peter, James, and John and led them up the mountain by themselves. Okay, again, here's this comparison between Jesus and Moses. Then the next verse, verse 2 of Matthew says, there he was transfigured before him, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Do you remember ever hearing the story about Moses coming down from the mountain and his face shone so bright he had to wear a veil? Here's another parallel to that as well. And we see that in chapter 24 of Exodus, where it says, when Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, And the glory of the Lord, we'll get back to the cloud in a minute. And the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days, there's that 6 days, the cloud covered the mountain. And on the 7th day, the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. Do you see some parallels? Wow. And to the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. So here again, the likeness of Jesus, his clothes shining and his face shining, as bright as light and like fire, basically. Super, super bright is an allusion here to Moses' experience on Mount Sinai. Now let's get back to the cloud. I just read it to you there. It came up, I don't know, 3 or 4 times within just those few verses about Moses being on the cloud. The cloud represents God's glory and God's presence. So we see the cloud up here on Mount Sinai, certainly with Moses. We also experience the cloud before this part of the story of Exodus, when Moses is taking the Israelites out of Egypt and they're walking through the wilderness. And what are they following? What is leading them? Well, it said a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. So that was a symbol of God's presence there that they were following. And we also hear about the cloud of God after this, when Moses gets the instructions for how to build a tabernacle. And on opening day, if you will, when they've completed the tabernacle, this cloud of the presence of God comes and enters and fills the tabernacle. So again, a symbol of God's presence and God's glory. And so here in chapter 17 of Matthew, we read about that too, a little bit later on. But we did read about the bright cloud covering them, right? Okay, and then finally I want to point, the other parallel that we see is the voice of God. This is when the voice speaks out of the cloud to Peter. Really to everybody present, right? But he interrupts Peter. And so there again, this is a parallel to what is happening here in Exodus with Moses when the Lord, it said, the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. And a little later, actually, that's the end of chapter 24, that little area, but Moses ends up entering into the cloud at the top of the mountain. And the very first verse in chapter 25 of Exodus says, and the Lord said to Moses. So again, the Lord speaking out of the cloud. Amazing stuff. Now, let me put this down. Okay. Matthew's emphasis here, I love the way N.T. Wright puts it, is that Jesus is like Moses, only more so. So this would have been really reassuring for those who were facing having to leave the synagogue. Remember, that's really one of the reasons why Matthew wrote this gospel. For those who were having to face leaving the synagogue in order to follow the faith with Jesus. So this all would have been a very reassuring story for them. So Jesus goes up the mountain and is compared to Moses, only more. I love that. What would the vision of Moses and Elijah stand for? What would it represent to a Jew? Well, as we already found out from Exodus 24, Moses is the one who went up Mount Sinai and received the law, the ever important law of God. So Moses represents the Mosaic law, or the law of God. And that is found, really the first 5 books of the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Scriptures, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, easy for me to say. Those 5 books, that's what Moses represents. And Elijah was one of the great prophets. So here we have the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets was another way of saying the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament to us Christians, the Old Testament, right? That's what they represent. You know, what would it have meant that Jesus was standing with those symbols of the law and the prophets? Well, why would they be standing in conversation with Jesus, Moses and Elijah? Why would they be standing there? It says they were talking with Jesus in verse 3. They are in conversation. They are in relationship somehow. But towards the end of the story, in verse 8, we see that Jesus stands alone. And that is what is significant. Jesus is certainly in conversation with the Hebrew scriptures. But in the end, both literally and figuratively, Jesus stands alone. And he stands there with God's blessing of final power and authority over the law and the prophets. Wow. I love what Dale Bruner says in his commentary on Matthew, that the Old Testament and the New Testament sing a duet, but the New Testament carries the melody. That's sort of the symbolism that we see here of Jesus standing with Moses and Elijah. It's kind of like what we read about in the Sermon on the Mount when we heard Jesus say, "You have heard it said, ... but I say to you." So he's referring to the Hebrew scriptures, but he's finalizing them with his own power and interpretation and authority. He is a continuation. The spiritual significance that the Old Testament is in subordination to Jesus. And again, that would be a message of reassurance to the audience of the original audience of this particular gospel. All right, now, in response to all of these events, what does Peter do? He wanted to get to work immediately on an ambitious project of his own design. And while Peter is still babbling about this, shall we say, a miraculous thing happens. He's talking about building a building plan for tabernacles and such. And out of this bright cloud that envelops him, the voice of God comes, literally interrupts Peter with all of his plans. The voice of God literally interrupts Peter. And he says, making it really clear that it's not about works of ministry or even about worship right now. Instead, he uses the words from the prophet Isaiah. We've heard them before. We heard them at Jesus' baptism, and we heard them in chapter 12, where the voice of God speaks, "This is my son." That's from Isaiah 42, verses 1 and 2. You can look it up later. "This is my son." And he goes on, "whom I love. In him I am well pleased." But then what was the last part of his message? Listen to him. So God interrupts all of Peter's plans to say, listen to him. And I think that this is what the message of this whole story is. Listen to Jesus. Above all, we are to listen to Jesus. Matthew is setting the stage for the rest of his gospel account. Because you see, we can't fully understand the crucifixion unless we come to an understanding of the meaning of the Transfiguration. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. He is the divine Son. And the divine one, and only the divine one, has the authority and the power to fulfill the law and the prophets. And everything that follows this account points to Jesus doing just that when he dies to our systems and our sins on the cross. So in summary, why do you think all of this took place? And why do you think Matthew chose to include it in his gospel? We get a little hint from verse 3 that we can read, "Just then there appeared before them," Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus, so them being the disciples. Perhaps this was for strengthening the disciples' faith. It was all for the purpose of them being able to see this and gain understanding of Jesus in preparation for what Jesus was going into when he came into Jerusalem. That's possible, yeah. Could it have been for the purpose of showing that Jesus is the continuation, I should say, of the law and the prophets, especially for those in the synagogues? Or would it be for the purpose of showing that the events to come were all a part of the plan? They were all planned out from the very beginning, and like I said, in continuity with the Old Testament. So what was going to happen was just all a part of that, in conversation with that and continuing it. Was it for the purpose of revealing Jesus' actual divinity and his authority by having him shining brilliantly? And the voice of God, of course, saying, "This is my son." Or perhaps it was for the purpose of showing Matthew's audience Jesus' divine status and blessing. Well, to all of those, I would say yes. It could be any and all of those. But in closing, I want to pay attention to the disciples' response to this whole event of the Transfiguration. What do we read? They fell face down to the ground, terrified. Their response was fear and humiliation. They were terrified. Terror was their response. They hit the floor face down. But Jesus comes to them and he touches them. He reaches out and he touches them. And his words are not only words of comfort, but they are words that emboldened the disciples and changed them forever. And in addition, these words were words that would encourage others and help them to step fully into the faith. Now get up and don't be afraid anymore. And then we hear those words spoken from the cloud. Listen to him. When we finally experience the fullness of Jesus' glory and the authority that he has in our lives, when we finally see Jesus in full technicolor, if you will, we want to do everything that we can to act on that. And so we join the church. We get really involved in the church, which is a great thing. And we develop programs and activities, and we create these amazing worship experiences, and we start these big building projects for God, to build big buildings for him. But in this account, God interrupts all of that, as if God is trying to tell us that the way to change lives is to listen to Jesus. And the Apostle Paul echoes this as well when he says, faith comes by hearing. You see, we may feel, is that enough? I mean, just listening to Jesus? But history has shown that all of the church programs in the world and the great big cathedrals built for God, as great and glorious as they are, do not change the inner life of a person as much as just time spent listening to Jesus and then acting on his words. Some of the most effective inner spiritual transformation happens in listening prayer and in contemplation. Yet, how much time do we set aside for that? Really? I mean, it feels better, quite honestly, to be busy. We feel better about ourselves. It sort of validates us. And we're always looking for self-validation. I bring that up a lot, don't I? Sorry. But it's true. And it feels better to feel like we're doing something, just like Peter wanted to do something to commemorate the moment and do something for God. But God's just saying, no, you know what? Just sit quietly and listen. And that can terrify us. And meeting Jesus, whew, how humbling. And experiencing God's glory, petrifying, absolutely petrifying. But through this author's account, we can still hear the words of Jesus when he reaches out and touches us and says, through our doubts and our terror, he reassures us saying, get up now, be strong, take courage, Be assured. And don't be afraid anymore. And this, just like Technicolor, changes everything. Go now in peace.